Today, I have the honor and privilege of introducing one of my teachers, Dr. Beverly Roberts Gaventa. Yeah, Dr. Gaventa is the Distinguished Professor of New Testament at Baylor University and has previously taught at Princeton Theological Seminary, Columbia Seminary, and Colgate-Rochester Divinity School. She is one of the foremost scholars in her field and has served as president of the Society of Biblical Literature. Dr. Gaventa specializes in the theological and historical interpretations of the letters of Paul, particularly the letter to the Romans. And if anyone can help you love Paul, which I know is a stretch for some of us, it's Dr. Gaventa. She's the author of When in Romans, An Invitation to Linger with the Gospel According to Paul, and of Apocalyptic Paul, and of one of my favorites, Our Mother, St. Paul, as well as many other excellent books. In addition to her academic work, Dr. Gaventa is an ordained elder in the PCUSA. She lives here in Waco with her husband Bill, and her grandson Charlie and his parents live in Austin. I'm really fortunate to have studied with Dr. Gaventa here at Baylor over the past few years, and I can attest to both her commitment to scholarship and to ecclesial life, and her fierce and unwavering support for women who preach. So please help me welcome Dr. Beverly Roberts Gaventa.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you, Kendall, for this invitation. The light is so great that I'm not entirely sure I can see anyone, but it will settle in. I'm really honored to be part of this gathering and to learn from you and alongside you. My first task after extending that Thanksgiving is to critique my own title. The apostle himself, my title for this morning is, Nevertheless, She Preached Paul. Now, the apostle himself would object, would be the first to say, we don't preach Paul. Genoita, he would assert, and loudly, of course not, or roughly translated, hell no. But you understood at the outset why I would take such a title. I doubt that anyone wondered about the nevertheless in my title. George Bernard Shaw famously identified Paul as the eternal enemy of women. Now, he didn't say which women, but women preachers and teachers will be forgiven for regarding Paul as the enemy of our vocations. For a decade or more at Princeton Seminary, I regularly taught a course called Women and the Letters of Paul. When I first proposed that class, a couple of my colleagues, and I have to admit, they actually were friends and supporters, but a couple of them snickered. This should be an afternoon's conversation, not a whole course. The first semester it was offered, 50 people signed up. And they didn't ask that question anymore. Why did they come? Well, you know the answer to that question. A good number of them came in battered. They came from traditions that would not ordain them, traditions that refused to recognize their vocations. Others, even if well received in their own denominations, came from families in which there was conflict having to do with their vocations, and especially the Apostle Paul. After several attempts, I learned to say to them what I will say to you: I have no manual for changing people's opinions about Paul, especially about Paul and women. If I did, believe me, I would have written and sold that book a long time ago. And I would have an apartment in Manhattan. Or at least I'd be able to rent one for a month or so. But I do have some observations that might be helpful. First of all, I want to say a little bit about the troublesome texts. Now, I'm guessing this will be old hat for some of you, but maybe not all, and refresher courses might be helpful. The text people introduce to undermine women, especially women vocationed to pastoral ministry, come from the pastoral epistles, which I think Paul did not write, and from a few lines of 1 Corinthians, badly read. I'm just going to leave that there. If we want to come back and talk about it later, I'm happy to do that. That's where people start and that's where they stay. And we know that wherever you start dictates a lot of where you end up. But we might start at an entirely different place. Now, as one of my colleagues said to me recently, back in your day, it's lucky you didn't get punched in the nose. It was often Galatians 3:28. But I want to start with Romans 16. Romans 16, where Paul concludes his important letter by greeting Prisca, named first. She's the one who gets the first billing. And Aquila, and the church in their house. This is not because she was serving cookies, but because that's where the church met. Then he greets Andronicus and Junia, who was identified for the first millennium of the church's life as an apostle, until somebody realized that was a woman's name and decided it would be two men traveling together. Take your choice. Other women are greeted as well, whom Paul praises for their labor on behalf of the gospel, without any reference to gendered roles. But I like especially to start with Phoebe. Paul doesn't send greetings to Phoebe, he commends her. He identifies her as a deacon. There is no such word in Greek as deaconess, it's deacon. And he identifies her as a benefactor, which means what it says. It's not a helper. He does this almost certainly because she is the one who takes the letter. No one else is named who might have delivered the letter. It's entirely reasonable to assume, therefore, that Phoebe also reads the letter. This letter was important for Paul. However, we resolve the big debate, and scholars are going to blather about it forever. However, we resolve the debate about why he wrote the letter is terribly important to him. He entrusts it to someone he thinks can interpret it on his behalf, and she reads the letter. Now, if you've ever watched, say, Fox News versus MSNBC, you know that how the news is read makes a great deal of difference. How the scripture's read makes a great deal of difference. She's the one who interprets the letter first. Even if she didn't read it, even if we buy into the notion that she couldn't have done that, she's still the one who represents him. She is the first interpreter of this letter. One of these days I'm going to say that without getting weepy. You have to be in my shoes to know what that means. Because for 2,000 years since, most of the interpreters we know anything about are men. Now, I'm going to come back to Phoebe later. My point for now is simply that starting with Romans 16 gives us an entirely different slant on Paul. He is not, in Romans 16, the enemy of women in their ministry, and he's no mere supporter, as if support belonged to him to dole out. He is a fellow worker. He acknowledges the multiplicity of women's vocations and mentions nothing by way of restriction. Now, this gathering assumes that women do preach, women teach preaching, we even have the t-shirts. But why preach Paul? Why even bother? One of the first things I hear about Paul is the claim that he's terribly arrogant. Right? I'll put my finger down in one spot, Galatians 1:11. I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel proclaimed by me is not of human origin. I didn't receive it from a human source, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. Could put our fingers down in many other spots, and we would come away with the attitude that Paul is pretty arrogant. Let me ask you to think about why he might be doing that. It may be that he needs to claim his authority in an environment that doesn't credit his authority. Anybody else here ever had that experience? We also often act without being perceived to have authority, even if we have the vocation, the education, even the licensing. So maybe we have something in common with Paul from the outset. All right, so to this point, my comments have been in the defensive column. As Natalie has already said, I'm a great fan. I like to stand up for him. But there's more. Paul is crucial for all of us, but perhaps especially for women, in ways that seldom come to expression. Again, there are many pertinent texts, but on an occasion like this, I want to go back to the one where I first got it, and that's 2 Corinthians 5:16 and 17. And I'm reading it in my own rough translation. So, from now on, we no longer know anyone according to the flesh. The Greek phrase is katasarka. You need to have that one. Even if we once knew Christ according to the flesh, katasarka, now we no longer know that way. So if someone is in Christ, new creation. The old has passed. Look, the new has come. Now, it is possible that all Paul means is that once upon a time, people knew Jesus in Jerusalem, and they recognized him. He was just another guy, another crazy teacher. But now that they know of his resurrection, they recognize him as Messiah, as God's Son. It's possible, but not very likely, that that's all he means. To this point in 2 Corinthians, he has been comparing things. He compares genuine ministry with fake ministry. He compares the reading of Israel with the vision of the apocalypse that has come upon him. He compares ministry of strength, so-called, versus ministry of weakness. The question under the surface for several chapters has been, how do we decide? How do we assess? How do we know? What criteria do we use? That long line reaches its apex at this point. Now, he writes, after the death and resurrection of Jesus, and because of it, not by virtue of our own enlightenment, but because of what has happened, We know no one according to the flesh. We assess no one. We evaluate no one. Because we know now that we assessed Christ in the wrong way. So if anyone is in Christ, new creation, new eyes, new vision, new perception. Let me get to the heart of the matter. I could go on about that one for a while. This is not just about Paul and his opponents. And it's not just about male pride. That's one of the ways Paul was stolen from women. As we've read it, we've been told that this is about male pride, about battles over who's the biggest and the baddest. But it has to do with that myriad of ways in which we assess other human beings and ourselves by standards that have nothing to do with the gospel. I want to start this by thinking about it in very personal terms. As women, particularly as Christian women, and many of us here as Southern women, I grew up in a redneck town in West Tennessee, we are susceptible to forms of assessment, especially the ones we inflict on ourselves. We are schooled by the kata sarka system to believe deep down that we are our dress size, our hairstyle, our skin care, our relationships, our careers, our children, maybe even the meals we take for the hot dish supper. And many of us find ourselves crippled by those kata sarka concerns. I do it on a regular basis. And then there are the bigger items, the way we assess others. This litany is a long and shameful one. We could start with skin color, place of origin, income, class, education, body size, shape, ethnicity, sexual identity, political affiliation, religious commitment, age, able-bodiedness. I'm sure I've left some things out. Feel free to add them. These are all kata sarka criteria. None of them has any place in the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's what we learn from Paul. We are new creations, people who have been gifted and freed to see God's gifts in others. The word, of course, is grace. But grace isn't just about whether we're saved from a hot place. It's about God's redemption of us from our own crippled and crippling ways of seeing the world and ourselves. Now, even if we see that part, the challenge is how we read Paul for preaching and teaching. And that's another class that would take us a long time, but I want to give you a couple of examples because I think they may be helpful. And it's not neurosurgery. This is not nuclear physics. It's very simple. Follow the text. Watch it. Trust it to do its work. Watch where it takes you. Let me give a couple of examples. 1 Thessalonians 5, the end of 1 Thessalonians. We've had the long Thanksgiving. This is a church with which Paul has a great relationship. He offered a number of ethical teachings. And then at the end, he gives a set of instructions to the whole congregation. So Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, give thanks in everything, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. Don't quench the Spirit, don't reject prophecy, but test everything. Hold on to the good and avoid every kind of evil. Now, about that time, I don't know about you, but I'm thinking, right, you lost me at pray without ceasing. Rejoice always. There are people in this room who know that's not my modus operandi. This is not possible. But then what does he say next? May the God of peace sanctify you wholly and keep you spirit and flesh and body blameless until the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. Do you see what he did? He went from this long list of things that we can't possibly do to the notion that it's God who's doing it. And I left off the most important part. The one who is calling you is faithful. God will do it. So this imperative is joined to a reminder about God's role. But you kind of have to slow down and watch where he's leading you. Watch where he's taking you. Of course, I won't read all of it, but of course, the very best, the most obvious example of this, I can't believe how many people don't see it, is the second half of Romans 1. Right? That text where he talks about how God handed humanity over because humanity didn't recognize God. And what's he doing? He's playing on stereotypes about Gentiles. You know, they're the ones who eat anything and sleep with anybody and and worship all sorts of gods they made themselves, and they get food for free, and they drive around in big cars. You know them. Then what does he do? You there, every one of you who judges, you bring judgment on yourself because you are doing the very same things. So my best advice about Paul is watch where he takes you. Be prepared, just as when you hear a parable, be prepared for him to turn on you. Because it's going to happen. So I said I would go back to Phoebe, and I want to do that now. Phoebe read this letter, this fantastically important biblical book of Romans, to its first audiences. So what happened, do you think, when she read it for the first time? I imagine there might have been a certain group that pumped their fists in the air when they heard the second half of Romans 1 about the depraved lives of the Gentiles, only to curl up in a corner when it turned out that Jews also are in the power of sin. Did the soaring promises at the end of Romans 8 move everybody to tears? Did some smug Gentiles hang their heads when they were reminded of God's irrevocable promises to Israel? Did anyone have a clue what he meant with Romans 13? Perhaps Phoebe didn't stand a chance, no matter how powerful her interpretation. The early Christian rumor mill may already have spread the word of Paul's reputation as a lover of nasty Gentiles. So I suspect a contingent of folks sat there with their arms folded across their chests, waiting for a misstep that would confirm their suspicions. Now, we could take this journey just a little longer into the land of imagination. But notice what else Paul says. He says, welcome her in the Lord, as is fitting for the saints. Help her in whatever she may need from you. At the very least, he wants the welcome mat put out for Phoebe. The bed linens need to be clean, and another handful of noodles needs to go in the tuna hot dish. But of course, I've neglected the most important part. Welcome her in the Lord, as is fitting for the saints. Now, if we've been following the letter, we know that line. You know that line. In 14:1, when Paul takes up conflicts about what we're going to eat, he begins this way: welcome those who are weak in faith, but not for the purpose of quarreling about opinions. Some people believe in eating anything, while others eat only vegetables. Those who eat must not despise those who abstain, and those who abstain must not pass judgment on those who eat, for God has welcomed them. As he develops this argument about how believers are to deal with serious, substantial differences, church-dividing differences about practice, the conviction comes to the fore again: we are not our own. We belong to God, and we have no right to judge one another. Our task is not to judge, but to upbuild, a most neglected Pauline word. Let us pursue what makes for peace and mutual upbuilding. He returns to that same point in chapter 15, the culmination of the whole letter. Welcome one another just as Christ has welcomed you, for the glory of God. This is not an option from Paul. It's a command. So to welcome Phoebe in the Lord, as is fitting for the saints, is more than just making sure she has a full belly and a warm bed. It means to receive her, not because of her own strength of character, not because we agree with the letter, not contingent at all, but as God's own servant. Those of us who are gathered here understand all too well that Phoebe might not have been welcomed. I can hear it. You can too. Some people are saying, she's really too young for that kind of responsibility. Others are saying, God, she is over it, past her prime. A few will find her too aggressive, and some will say she's too passive. Some will say she's overqualified for the role of letter carrier. Or maybe she's not bright enough to interpret this letter. She might be too attractive to be taken seriously, or too serious to be found attractive. Now that's really kind of a fun game, and we can all play. It's easy to see ourselves in the role of the one who needs hospitality. But Paul always turns on us. Where does this text pinch our toes? Where is the Phoebe we don't want to receive either? The letter we don't want to hear. Perhaps we do not want to be reminded that we actually do belong to one another. It is much easier to gather in cliques of the like-minded, where the in-jokes are well received. Perhaps we prefer to imagine that hospitality is all about us and our people skills, disconnected from God's action. Maybe we like the do-it-yourself spirituality, divorced from God's initiative. Romans has a lot to say it would be easier not to hear. But finally, this passage and the whole of the letter is a stimulus not just to imagine the situation of Phoebe, or even to reflect on receptivity, our own or that of other people. Finally, this passage is part of the gospel Paul preached. A welcome, our welcome, means that our welcome of one another inhabits a tiny corner of God's welcome of us, of all of us. Nevertheless. Now, I think I've left probably more time than I want to hear questions. But let me hear questions, comments, and I'll repeat them if I need to for everybody to hear, okay? And I can't, don't assume I can see, so yeah.
Do you have a recommendation for any books about Phoebe?
Not right offhand. I actually, in When in Romans, the little book that Natalie mentioned, I actually do some of what I did here about her role. There's a wonderful book by Carolyn Osick and Margaret MacDonald called it's not Her Share of the Blessings. Carolyn Osick and Lynn MacDonald about a woman's place, about women's leadership and women's hospitality, and I think it will go into some of that. Yeah. Really? No questions? No, but why did he write this or that? Yes. I think my answer is going to be, the question was about how to bring some of these ideas into congregations. When I did a lay school in Dallas on Saturday, and what I do with Romans in particular is I start at the end. I always start teaching Romans at the end, or I almost always do. In part because people have such notions of Paul as writing doctrine, and they think he's writing sort of abstract propositions that are all strung together. So if we start with the people at the end of the letter and talk about who might have been there and what it looked like, again, I'm sorry, I did this, I don't like advertising, but I did some of this in When in Romans. Then I think it helps to make clear that it is a letter, a piece of communication. And I think that helps at the very outset. On the question, is that where you were going? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I would be very worried about disagreeing with Sarah Coakley, but I might on this one. She's doing a quite different sort of thing. She's doing a theological interpretation. One of the things I will say right off the bat, and I sort of skimmed over it as I was talking about 1 Corinthians, as I made a comment about a few sentences badly read, is that it's really important to get our heads straight about what Paul's doing in that whole passage, right? What is he doing? He assumes that women are praying and prophesying in worship. That whole section of the letter is about worship. He assumes that women are praying and prophesying. So what he's after is the appropriate appearance. The reason I'm stumbling is that the Greek is pretty unclear. And there are 42 variations on this argument about whether he really means veil. This is why I'm not so sure about Coakley's argument. It's not so clear whether it means veil or whether he means they need to have their hair up. Assuming it's long hair, it needs to be up. I don't do this very well. But it needs to be up because having loose hair has. Now, there are other issues. There are other texts that look quite different on this question about what is the cultural norm that he's bothered by. But even there, the bottom line is he wants women, he's trying to get at what makes it possible without creating temptation for the angels. Who knew they had so many problems? There are bad actors among the angels. We all know about that. Without creating scandal, right? And I would say it's not one of Paul's better moments. You know, when he starts throwing in, well, nature teaches you. You know, it doesn't teach me that. Unfortunately, we seem to forget that when we go over to Romans 1 and he argues from nature, right? There was another hand here. Yeah, the end of 1 Corinthians 14, you know. I am very conservative when it comes to thinking that something is an addition, right? But I actually think that those lines at the end of 1 Corinthians 14, which move around in the manuscript tradition, may well be something one of Paul's less bright students. No. I do think it's someone who is sympathetic with the approach of the writer of the pastorals, who has possibly even included this as a marginal note, and then it is later incorporated. When things move around in the manuscript tradition, I think we're right to wonder where it came from and what it's doing there. Okay. There was, yes? It was about the end of Romans 14.
My question is this. You mentioned that you doubted that this was written by Paul in your speech. Was this it?
No, the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus.
So would you please elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. The question was about things I think Paul did not write. It includes that, but 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. Now, for many years, this was sort of assumed by most critical scholars. I think it is still the majority view, although there are others who have called this into question. But there are just so many, not simply about women, but there's so much in the pastorals that seems to reflect a considerably later period when people are worried about church order, who is fit for certain kinds of offices. Paul uses the language of, the author of the pastorals uses the language of the faith, which is not the language that Paul uses. So there are a number of issues of content in those letters that cause people to think they are written by someone in the Pauline school. I would say somebody who got maybe a C-. Yes? I hope I've succeeded. There's still time. I'm not a Baptist, but I'll do an altar call.
Talk to me for a second about that thorn in the flesh passage. That's one that
Really?
Yeah, that's awfully, well, in that it's one
Oh,
trying to be ourselves in a church that
right,
doesn't accept us.
right. Yeah, it's one thing for people to say that the gospel may require suffering of any of us. It's another thing to say, boy, you should just be so glad for it, and just suck it up. But Paul is in, boy, this is sort of stretching me because I haven't looked at 2 Corinthians in a while, except to go back to that bit that I talked about earlier. That whole part of 2 Corinthians is Paul's argument with people who assess themselves by, how big their churches are, how big their budgets are. We fill in the blanks, supply whatever you like there. And they have, at least as we see it from his perspective, they have lampooned him as being weak. He doesn't take money. What kind of a person doesn't take money? That shows he has a bad conscience, right? By the standards of the day, right? He's not a very good speaker. So, he's just not, we're the real ones. And what he's doing in all of that is trying to upend that. So he revels in, he does this, I know somebody who had visions. I don't know, was it the third heaven or the 10th? And he's sort of, he makes fun of his own spiritual experiences. He makes fun of his own weakness, not makes fun of it, but he lifts it up by way of saying, these are the things God has given me. It's not there to be a kind of moral template for us. That's one of the other problems that we have, right? Not just with Paul, but with all of Scripture, is we want to make everything a moral template. And sometimes those texts are there for other reasons altogether, which doesn't mean that we toss them out, but we ask, what are they doing? And maybe, and this is going back to the question of preaching, Paul, where do I find myself, my congregation, in this? If you can't preach the strength versus weakness these days, I can't help you, because we live in a culture that is just obsessed with displaying our own greatness. And so, the gospel's displaying the weakness of a handicapping condition is it's a slap in the face to our culture. Right? Yeah.
What kind of lenses or lens do you use to talk about Paul? I feel like there are so many people that see Jesus but then see Paul as the one who defines everything that we do. Even though for some of us those teachings kind of contradict maybe what Jesus taught. So how do you present Paul to congregations?
The question, I don't know if everybody here, the question was, how do I present Paul in view of the fact that he's so often been characterized and criticized, right, as the one who sort of, we have Jesus, but then Paul comes along and Paul sort of invents Christianity. I'm putting words in your mouth. That's the way it's often said. I think Paul would be mortified by that sort of elevating of himself. That's why I was making fun of my title at the beginning, because Paul would not be preaching Paul. And he would be mortified at my using the expression that way. I think there are many, many direct lines between the teaching of Paul and the teaching of Jesus. And ways in which, but I do think, just like any generation, Paul's mission, and I think probably this needs to be the last, Kendall, yeah. Paul's mission takes him into places Jesus didn't go. Paul has new settings that Jesus wasn't in. So that whole business in 1 Corinthians 7 about what do we do when we find ourselves married to people who are of different, who don't share our faith? That's not a question Jesus addressed, right? And he finds himself sometimes saying, well, we have this teaching of Jesus, but then I think, and part of it is Paul's context is not Jesus's. So when you start interpreting the gospel in new settings, you find that you have to negotiate between, I am sure of this we rely on, and this has to be interpreted in new ways. Of course, Jesus has something to say about that too. All right. Thank you all very much.